Their footsteps echoed faintly against the polished floors, a sound so alien it froze them in place. For years, these young Nazi nurses had walked through cold, grey corridors where the air smelled of disinfectant and fear, where patients were lined in overcrowded wards and treated like statistics rather than human beings. But now, as the heavy doors of an American military hospital swung open before them, their eyes widened in disbelief. The smell was different first. Clean, yes, but not sterile and suffocating. The hallways gleamed with light, lined with fresh sheets and flowers brought in by volunteers. They could hear laughter, actual laughter from patients and nurses alike. And most shocking of all, they saw something their training had never prepared them for. American doctors and nurses leaning over wounded German prisoners of war, tending to their injuries with the same care as they did for their own. The Nazi nurses stood frozen, staring at a world that defied everything they had been taught. Weren't these Americans supposed to be soft, incapable of handling the brutality of war? Weren't the wounded enemies supposed to be neglected, punished, or cast aside? Yet here they were, witnessing a medical system built not on fear, but on compassion. Their silence was heavy, their faces pale. Some felt admiration, others shame. None could fully understand it yet, but all of them knew, in that instant, that nothing they believed about medicine, or even about humanity, would ever be the same again. What they saw in that moment would haunt and transform them forever. The hospitals of Nazi Germany were not places of healing. They were machines, cold and unrelenting, designed to serve the war effort and the ideology that fueled it. Step inside one of those wards during the height of the Second World War, and the first thing you would notice was the suffocating air. The smell of antiseptic was overwhelming, barely masking the stench of unwashed bodies and untreated wounds. Beds were crammed together, sometimes 3 or 4 soldiers sharing a space meant for one. The groans of the wounded mixed with the clipped bark of orders from superiors, creating an atmosphere where fear outweighed comfort. For the nurses, many of them barely out of adolescence, there was no room for kindness. Their training was rooted not in compassion, but in obedience. Every movement was regulated, every mistake punished. Senior matrons, often loyal party members, watched closely, ensuring that the regime's rigid rules were followed without question. A nurse caught showing too much sympathy to the wrong kind of patient risked discipline, reassignment, or worse. In these wards, mercy was a liability, and then there was the ideology that hung over everything, like a dark cloud. Not every patient was considered equal. German soldiers were prioritized, their lives deemed valuable to the war machine. But others, the disabled, the chronically ill, the foreign laborers forced into service, were often seen as burdens. Sometimes they were denied proper treatment altogether. In certain facilities, doctors and nurses alike participated in what was chillingly called mercy killing, part of the regime's eugenics program. To the Nazi state, preserving resources mattered more than preserving life. Supplies, too, were always short. Penicillin, widely available to the Allies, was practically non-existent in German hospitals. Bandages were reused until they fell apart. Surgeons performed amputations without proper anesthesia. Nurses were forced to improvise, boiling instruments again and again, knowing infection could still take their patients. Every day was a battle against scarcity, but instead of fostering solidarity, the shortages only reinforced the cold hierarchy. A soldier considered valuable to the Reich might get the last dose of morphine. A wounded conscript from occupied Poland might not even be given clean water. The nurses learned to harden themselves. They had to. Watching young men bleed out on stretchers, listening to screams in understaffed wards, they built walls inside their hearts. Some buried their emotions deep, carrying out their duties mechanically, convincing themselves this was all for the greater good. Others, however, found themselves breaking, secretly sneaking scraps of food, whispering words of comfort, or defying orders when no one was watching. But those moments were dangerous. Even compassion had to be hidden in the Nazi hospital system, and above it all loomed the propaganda. Nurses were constantly reminded that they were not simply caretakers, but soldiers of health, defenders of racial purity. Posters on the walls reinforced the message, "The strong must survive. The weak must not burden the state." In such an environment, humanity itself was under siege. Medicine was stripped of its soul, twisted into another weapon of war. For the young women working in these hospitals, life was an endless cycle of exhaustion, fear, and indoctrination. They rose before dawn, scrubbed until their hands bled, stood for hours on end, and collapsed into their bunks at night, only to repeat it all the next day. Yet even in their exhaustion, they were reminded that their duty was not to the patients before them, but to the Reich. This was the world they knew, the only world they thought existed. Cold, harsh, and merciless. And it was why, when the war ended and they were finally exposed to American hospitals, the contrast struck them like a bolt of lightning. For the first time, they would see medicine practiced not as an extension of ideology, but as an act of humanity. But before that moment came, they would first have to walk out of the shadows of everything they had been taught, carrying the weight of what they had seen and the guilt of what they had done. While German hospitals struggled under the weight of shortages and ideology, the American medical system was moving in a very different direction. On the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, American field hospitals became symbols of ingenuity and resilience. They were not perfect. War never allowed for perfection, but compared to the rigid, suffocating environment of Nazi hospitals, they felt almost revolutionary. Imagine a tent, hastily erected just miles behind the front lines. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. Another patch of khaki in a sea of military canvas. But inside, the air hummed with energy and precision. Doctors worked under bright electric lamps, powered by portable generators. Their hands steady, even as shells echoed in the distance. Nurses moved quickly between patients, their uniforms stained, but their expressions calm, offering words of comfort as they changed bandages or adjusted morphine drips. What set the American system apart was not just its equipment, though there was plenty of that. Blood banks traveled with the troops, ensuring that transfusions could be performed even in the most desperate situations. Mobile surgical units rolled behind advancing divisions, bringing skilled surgeons directly to the wounded. It meant that a soldier hit on the battlefield could be receiving advanced medical care within hours, a miracle compared to the delays and shortages of the German front. But the true difference lay in philosophy. To the Americans, a patient was not just a soldier in uniform. He was a human being, and that philosophy extended even to the enemy. German prisoners of war, some of them captured only hours before, found themselves lying side by side with American soldiers, their wounds stitched, their fevers treated, their pain relieved. The nurses and doctors didn't ask what flag their patients had fought under. They simply treated the injury in front of them with the same determination to preserve life. This was not accidental. It was part of the training. American medical personnel were taught that their duty was to life itself. Compassion was emphasized as much as efficiency. Nurses were encouraged to speak to their patients, to reassure them, to remind them they were not alone. This wasn't just sentimentality, it had practical value. Soldiers who felt cared for recovered faster, both physically and mentally. The Americans understood that healing wasn't only about the body, it was about the mind as well. In many field hospitals, chaplains and Red Cross volunteers moved among the cots, offering prayers, letters from home, or even just a hand to hold. Small comforts, a cigarette, a clean sheet, a smile, meant everything to men who had seen too much death. For those broken by trauma, psychologists and medical officers began pioneering treatments for what would later be called PTSD. They called it battle fatigue. But they recognized the importance of tending to invisible wounds. Supplies, too, reflected the American advantage. Penicillin, mass-produced on a scale the world had never seen before, flowed into military hospitals. Infections that would have been a death sentence in a German ward were now survivable. New surgical techniques, vascular repair, skin grafting, reconstructive surgery, were being refined every day, sometimes right there in the tents. War was brutal, but American medicine was learning how to fight back in ways that saved lives instead of discarding them. And unlike the harsh authoritarian discipline of Nazi wards, the culture here was different. Of course, there was order, there had to be, but nurses could speak up if they noticed something wrong. A young lieutenant nurse could question a doctor if she saw a mistake. This collaborative spirit wasn't just practical, it was humanizing. It created an atmosphere where teamwork, rather than fear, drove the work forward. To the Nazi nurses who would later step into this world, it felt like entering another universe. They could not understand how enemy soldiers were treated with dignity, how resources were shared rather than hoarded, how compassion was woven into every action. To them, hospitals had always been extensions of ideology, places where cruelty often outweighed care. Here in American hospitals, they saw something unthinkable, medicine unchained from politics, guided instead by humanity. And as they would soon learn, that difference was not only shocking, it was transformative. For the first time, they would begin to question everything they had been told about mercy, about duty, and about the true meaning of healing. The war was over, but the echoes of its brutality lingered in every ruined street and burned-out city across Germany. For the defeated, the surrender in May 1945 was not just an end, it was a reckoning. Nazi soldiers laid down their weapons, officials fled or faced trials, and those who had served in the regime's vast machinery suddenly found themselves stripped of purpose. Among them were the nurses. Many were taken into custody, others reassigned under Allied occupation, and some found themselves working in a place they had never imagined, American-run hospitals. At first, they entered reluctantly, their eyes lowered, their uniforms faded, their pride broken. These women had lived years inside a system that prized order above compassion and ideology above life. Now standing on foreign, clean linoleum floors, they faced a world that looked almost unreal. The smell of antiseptic lingered here too, but mingled with it was something they could barely place. Soap, flowers, and even the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting from staff rooms. It was as if these hospitals were breathing differently, alive in a way their own had never been. The shock began with the wards themselves. Beds stood neatly spaced, each with fresh linen and clean water at the bedside. No overcrowding, no rows of bodies stacked in desperation. Patients here had privacy curtains, small comforts like books or letters from home resting on the tables beside them. And the patients themselves, what stunned the German nurses most, were not only Americans. They saw wounded German soldiers, still in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, being treated with the same precision, the same care, the same humanity as their supposed enemies. One young nurse, who had been taught that American medicine was weak and indulgent, froze when she saw a U.S. surgeon bend over a German prisoner writhing in pain. The surgeon barked for more morphine, his tone urgent but steady, his gloved hands working with complete focus. "We don't lose him today," he said firmly, as though the German's life was as valuable as any other. The nurse stood rooted, her face pale, her hands trembling. This was not the world she knew. In their own hospitals, compassion had been rationed like medicine. But here, compassion flowed freely. American nurses spoke gently to their patients, leaning close, smoothing their hair, adjusting pillows, whispering words of reassurance. German nurses, watching from the sidelines, felt a strange mix of emotions: admiration, confusion, even guilt. They had been told kindness was weakness, that mercy to an enemy was betrayal. And yet they could not deny the healing power radiating from these scenes. The contrast cut deep. Some of the Nazi nurses found themselves secretly longing to be part of this system, to learn, to touch a patient's hand without fear of reprimand. Others recoiled, their minds clashing with the indoctrination that still held them hostage. "It's a trick," one whispered to herself. "It must be propaganda." But as days turned to weeks, the truth became harder to deny. The Americans weren't pretending. They lived this philosophy every single day. For some, shame bloomed like a sickness. They remembered the patients they had turned away, the harsh orders they had carried out, the faces of those who never made it because the system decided they weren't worth saving. Now, seeing the Americans treat even their own countrymen with respect, that guilt grew unbearable. One nurse was overheard murmuring through tears, "We could have done this. We should have done this." But there were also sparks of hope. A few of the German nurses began quietly taking notes, watching procedures, absorbing techniques they had never been taught, proper sterilization methods, blood transfusion practices, even the simple act of speaking to patients like human beings. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that medicine could be more than orders and ideology. It could be healing in its purest form. The Americans noticed the stares, the silent awe, the trembling hands of the former Nazi nurses. Some welcomed them gently, offering training, sharing practices without judgment. Others were wary, their eyes hardened with the memory of what those uniforms represented. Still, in the wards themselves, where life and death balanced on a knife's edge, even old enemies were bound by a shared mission to keep a human being alive. The war had shattered borders, destroyed cities, and taken millions of lives. But in these hospitals, something different unfolded. For the Nazi nurses who walked through those doors, it was as though they had stepped into another reality, a place where medicine was not twisted by cruelty, but lifted by compassion. They could no longer claim ignorance. They had seen with their own eyes a better way, a more human way, and that realization was both stunning and terrifying. Because once you see such a truth, you can never unsee it. But the most dramatic moment of reckoning still lay ahead, when the Nazi nurses would not only witness compassion, but experience it in ways that would shake them to their very core. The air inside the American hospital ward was thick with tension. A convoy of stretchers had just arrived, men pulled from the smoking wreckage of a battlefield that was, only days ago, alive with gunfire. Among the injured were Americans, their uniforms soaked with blood, and Germans, their faces grey with shock. The scene was chaos, groans of pain, the clatter of instruments, the hurried footsteps of nurses, but there was a rhythm to it, an urgency wrapped in discipline. The Nazi nurses stood against the wall, ordered to observe. Some clenched their fists, their instincts screaming that this was wrong, that enemies did not belong in the same space as the wounded sons of America. But then they saw it. An American surgeon, sleeves rolled up, hunched over a German soldier whose chest had been ripped open by shrapnel. The young man's face was ghostly pale, his breath shallow, his eyes barely flickering open. By every measure of Nazi ideology, this boy was expendable, an enemy, a defeated soldier. Yet the surgeon shouted for clamps, his hands steady, his face set in grim determination. "More blood now," he barked. The nurse beside him, an American barely older than the patient himself, nodded and hurried with the transfusion. Drops of crimson slid down the tube, life itself flowing back into the German's veins. The Nazi nurses stared in stunned silence. They had been told their whole lives that Americans were weak, sentimental, incapable of withstanding the hardness of war. And yet here was proof of the opposite. This was not weakness, it was strength. Strength to fight not just for victory, but for humanity. One of the German nurses, a girl no older than 21, whispered to herself in disbelief, "Why? Why would they save him?" Her voice trembled, as though she had asked the question out loud to the entire room. The answer came, though not directed to her. The American surgeon glanced briefly at his patient and muttered under his breath, "He's young. He has a chance." That was it. No politics, no ideology, only the conviction that life, any life, was worth saving. For the Nazi nurses, the scene unfolded like a revelation. They watched as the Americans worked tirelessly side by side, sweat dripping down their brows, hands stained red, never stopping, never faltering. And it was not only for the German boy. Just beyond, another team fought to stabilize an American soldier who had lost his leg. Across the room, a nurse carefully stitched the arm of yet another German, her voice soothing as she told him, "You'll be all right. Just hold on." This was the turning point. It was no longer abstract, no longer distant philosophy. They were watching compassion in action, compassion that did not discriminate between friend or foe. For some, the weight of it was unbearable. One nurse felt her knees weaken as tears burned in her eyes. She had once denied a Polish laborer a painkiller because her superiors had ordered it. The memory flooded back now, cruel and suffocating. She saw in the Americans what she had been forbidden to be, a healer, but alongside the shame was a flicker of something else, admiration. When the chaos calmed, when the German boy's breathing steadied under the surgeon's steady hands, the Americans did not pause to celebrate. They moved on to the next patient, and the next, as though this was simply what they were meant to do. Later, in quieter moments, the American nurses began to teach. They showed the Germans how to sterilize equipment properly, how to change bandages without spreading infection, how to monitor transfusions safely. One American nurse held up a vial of penicillin and explained how it had turned death sentences into recoveries. The German women watched with wide eyes, absorbing knowledge they had never been allowed to access. Whispers spread among them. We were lied to. They had been told Allied medicine was primitive, chaotic, inferior. But what they saw with their own eyes dismantled those lies piece by piece. These nurses weren't weak. They were skilled, confident, respected. These hospitals weren't inefficient. They were models of innovation. And the patients weren't treated as expendable. They were treated as human. Some of the Nazi nurses confessed privately, in hushed tones when the Americans couldn't hear, "If only our hospitals had been like this. If only we had been allowed to care like this." Their words were filled with regret, but also with a strange, budding hope that perhaps medicine could still be redeemed, even after the horrors of what they had served. But others resisted. For them, the sight was too much to accept. They muttered bitterly, clinging to the propaganda that had been drilled into them for years. Yet even they could not deny the evidence. They saw the German soldier breathing, alive because of the Americans. They saw their colleagues' fascination, their tears, their quiet transformations. The climax of this revelation was not just in what the Americans did, but in what the Germans felt. It was as though a mirror had been held up to their souls. In that reflection, they saw the truth, that medicine had been twisted under the Reich into something cruel, something inhuman. And standing before them was proof of another way, a way that healed, not harmed. By the end of that night, none of them could look at their past in the same way again. The walls they had built around their hearts, the obedience they had clung to, the lies they had swallowed, all of it began to crack. For the first time, they dared to imagine a world where a nurse could be more than a servant of ideology, a world where healing was not conditional. But such revelations came with a heavy burden, because once they admitted the truth, they had to face the question that now gnawed at them relentlessly. What did it say about them and the choices they had made that they had lived so long without seeing it? The answer would not come easily. It would linger in their dreams, haunt their conscience, and shape the lives they would lead after the war, when the guns fell silent and the rubble of the Reich was all that remained. The lessons the Nazi nurses carried from those American hospitals did not fade. For some, the images haunted them. German prisoners lifted gently onto clean sheets, American doctors fighting to save lives without pausing to ask whose side a man had fought for. Those memories dug deep, cracking the rigid shells of ideology that had once bound them. For others, the lessons were unbearable. They turned their eyes away, convincing themselves that what they had seen was a fluke or worse. Propaganda meant to humiliate them further, but the truth could not be ignored forever. The contrast between the brutality of Nazi hospitals and the humanity of American ones became a kind of mirror, forcing each nurse to confront what she had done and what she had failed to do. Some embraced the change. A handful of German nurses, particularly the younger ones, were profoundly transformed. They began to question the very foundation of what they had been taught, that only the strong deserved care, that the weak were expendable, that medicine was a weapon of ideology. After the war, when opportunities arose under Allied occupation, many of these women sought retraining. They learned modern techniques from the very people they had once called enemies. For them, the revelation inside American hospitals was not just shocking, it was liberating. They realized that nursing could be something noble again, an act of service to life itself. One nurse, years later, would confess in a post-war interview that the first time she was encouraged to comfort a patient with words, not just medicine, she nearly cried. "It felt like I was being allowed to be human again," she admitted. That single shift from obedience to compassion became the cornerstone of her new life as a caregiver. But others could not escape the weight of guilt. For every nurse who embraced change, there were those who carried dark memories like stones in their hearts. They remembered the patients denied care, the orders followed without question, the children and the disabled left to die under the policies of the Reich. For them, the sight of American compassion was not a revelation, but an accusation. Some drank heavily, others withdrew into silence, never speaking of what they had seen. Denial became their shield, though it could never truly erase the memories. On a broader scale, the lessons of these encounters rippled outward. Under Allied oversight, German medical education underwent sweeping reforms. The eugenics-driven policies of the Nazis were dismantled, replaced by a renewed emphasis on ethics, patient rights, and the sanctity of life. American practices, blood transfusions, widespread penicillin use, field surgery innovations were adopted into German hospitals, transforming them from the grim halls of ideology into spaces where modern medicine could flourish. Medical schools, too, changed their tone. Professors who had once lectured about racial purity were removed, replaced with doctors who stressed international standards of care. Students were taught that every patient had value, that compassion was not weakness, and that medicine must never again be twisted into a tool for cruelty. Slowly, painfully, the culture of German healthcare shifted, and yet beneath the progress, shadows remained. Not every nurse or doctor was willing to admit the depth of their complicity. Some insisted they had simply followed orders, that they had no choice. Others justified their actions by claiming ignorance, though in truth, most had seen enough to know. The American hospitals had shown them what was possible, and that contrast lingered in silence, a reminder of both shame and possibility. For the women who had witnessed it firsthand, the experience marked a dividing line in their lives. Before, they had lived in a world where obedience mattered more than humanity. After, they could no longer deny that another path existed. Some seized it, rebuilding their lives as healers in the truest sense. Others shrank from it, crushed by guilt or locked in denial. But none of them left unchanged, and for post-war Germany, the lesson was just as clear. The medical system of the Reich had collapsed in on itself, poisoned by ideology. The future would be rebuilt on the foundations of ethics and compassion, shaped in part by the quiet, haunting memories of nurses who had once stood in American hospitals and seen, with their own eyes, what medicine was meant to be. But history is never neat, and wounds do not close without scars. For these nurses, the greatest challenge was still ahead, finding a way to live with the knowledge of what they had done and what they had failed to do in a world forever changed. They had stepped into those American hospitals with suspicion, even fear, their minds still shaped by years of rigid training and ideology. What they found instead was something far more disarming than weapons or victories. It was compassion, clean wards, steady hands, gentle voices. The shock of seeing American doctors fight to save the lives of German prisoners shattered everything they thought they knew about strength. weakness and mercy. For many of those Nazi nurses, that moment marked the beginning of an inner war far greater than any fought on the battlefield. They were forced to confront the cruelty of the system they had served, to reckon with the silence they had kept, and to see clearly, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to heal. Some carried guilt, others transformation. But none could erase the image of enemies treated as human beings, of compassion triumphing where hate had ruled. History often remembers war in terms of battles and borders, but in those wars, another kind of victory unfolded. It was not won with guns, but with bandages, transfusions, and the refusal to let ideology dictate who deserved to live. That simple truth, that humanity is stronger than hate, was powerful enough to stun even those who had spent years believing otherwise. The lesson echoes still. War destroys, but humanity heals. And sometimes the most profound revolutions are not fought on the battlefield, but in the quiet, steady hands of those who choose to care, even when the world tells them not to.